Okay. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our North Brooklyn Night School class on immigration. I'm happy everyone's here. We feel like this is a very important issue, and I want to place immigration in the center of today's politics. Trump and the right pushed a hate-filled nativist narrative towards immigrants as their opening thrust in their move to move the U.S. right. Particularly, they placed this issue on the southern border with Mexico and Central America. In the last 4 years, Trump and the Republican Party and the right wing have tried to place the blame for continued problems of the working and middle class on immigrants. These immigrants were supposedly coming into the United States and taking what belonged to the US citizens. Meanwhile, the wealth of the top 1% grew precipitously, while the standard for living for the majority fell. There is no doubt that in the next period, they will move in that direction again. US policy towards revolutionary movements in Central and South America, as well as neoliberal economic bullying of the Caribbean and the South underlie these issues. It behooves us to develop a deeper understanding of these issues in order to arm ourselves for the next period. I want to introduce our speaker today. He's a member of DSA in Brooklyn. John Washington is a writer and translator and activist, a regular contributor to the Nation magazine, to The Intercept, and he writes on immigration, border policy, politics, as well as criminal justice, photography, and literature. He is the author of The Dispossessed, a story of asylum at the US-Mexican border and beyond. This book is newly available from Verso at a nice discount, or if you make a contribution to In These Times, they give it to you free. I just want to quote one of the people who wrote about him, Oscar Martinez. John Washington is a rarity in the world of Central American migration. He doesn't parachute into tragedy. He travels with humility and seeks to understand, not to reaffirm his hypothesis. This is the book from someone who has been understanding for a long time. He's been covering migration in Central America and Mexico and the United States. And I can say with complete conviction, read this book. So I'd like to welcome John Washington.
Hey, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for that, Lee. Very kind intro. And really glad to be having this conversation. It's been a while since I've been to one of the North Brooklyn meetings because of COVID and whatnot. So it's good to chime in at least via Zoom. So yeah, like as mentioned in the introductions, I'm going to be talking about border politics and immigration policy as it stands right now. And then sort of my angle, and one of the projects I'm working on right now is trying to understand and make the case for open borders. So I'm going to do that. And it's like a really long conversation, and there's a lot of ways to approach the topic. And I'm going to pick a couple and lay them out and talk for maybe 25 or so minutes. And then I'm really excited to have a conversation and hear from y'all and get deeper into it. Before I do that, I think that one of the things I want to say, and this is something that Lee, you mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of this conversation. So why I think that immigration politics and border politics and calling for open borders in and of itself is important. And there's a couple of ways to approach that. The first is through just numbers. And this is pretty simple, but I think it really drives home, at least for me, the magnitude of what we're dealing with right now. So currently, according to some calculations, there are 272 million international migrants in the world. And that is about 3.5% of the total human population. That percentage has gone up slightly in the last decade. Before that, it had held steady for about 100 years, which is pretty remarkable given how quickly the human population has been ballooning. And that is actually increasing now. And all signs point to it, the fact that it will increase as a percentage and in gross numbers even more in the next 30 years. Of that 272 million people, about 80 million are forcibly displaced. That is, they didn't choose to move, they were forced to. And that number, just that number, the 80 million, estimates say that it will rise to about 250 million, maybe as high as a $500 million by 2050. So given population estimates, by 2050, only 30 years from now, there will be very likely about 1/10 of the total human population that will be actually migrants, international migrants. And then once we take into account all the people that are touched by that, all the people who have family members who are migrants, who aren't maybe migrants themselves, and then internal migrants, it is going to be a pressing issue for everybody, pretty much, in the next 30 years. And climate change is one of the major factors of that, but by no means the only. One other number that I think is important to take into account is that over the last 15 years, there's an estimated 100,000 people who have died while trying to cross borders. That number, and a lot of people have tried to count the number of folks who have perished while crossing borders or crossing even a single border, and it's incredibly hard. I've spent a lot of time talking with people who looking at these estimates, and everyone recognizes that it's a huge undercount. So it could be as high as twice that many. So that is one of the reasons, and I think that's sort of on its own is pretty compelling. Another one of the reasons, I think this is kind of interesting for our group, is political. So there's a number of studies that have been done in the past few years, looking primarily but not exclusively at the rise of the far right in Europe. And the single most important factor for somebody joining a far right political group is that they have anti-immigration sentiment. In other words, there is no better predictor of someone joining a far right movement, whether it's a political party or even like a militia, than them being either just xenophobic or anti-migrant. So that is something to take into account too. And most of those studies have focused on Europe, but of course we see that in the United States as well. And so I think to understand the rise of fascism, the rise of the extreme right, we need to be understanding and approaching the issue from our own perspective. And that is to say, I think not only are we going to be on the defense, or should we only be on the defense, which I think is important, but I think there is a really key mobilizing potential as well in putting forth a pro-migrant and pro-immigration or pro-mobility agenda. And we've seen this. And we've seen this recently. In 2017, after the first Muslim ban was signed, there was a huge outpouring of support. People went to the airports and stood in solidarity with a lot of people. We saw it a couple of times during the Trump administration. We saw it in 2010 when people mobilized a boycott of an entire state when Arizona passed SB 1070, that basically show me your papers law. And then in 2006, 2007, and this is of interest to us especially, and maybe something we can touch on later, the huge pro-immigrant rallies and strikes that took place in LA and a lot of other cities throughout the country. So there is something for us, not just to be on defense, but there's some really positive political reasons to be on the right side of history here and be pushing and be talking about immigration. I'd like to quote, sorry, I have some notes I'm going to address right here. And I've been talking to this scholar and activist, Harsha Walia, recently. I'm doing an interview for her for The Nation, and I just talked to her a couple times this week. It's not out yet, but hopefully soon. And so her thinking, I just read her book, Border and Rule, her new book, and her thinking has been really very influential in the way I've been thinking about having this conversation. So I'm going to quote something that she just said to me, which goes to the idea of this mobilizing factor of immigration. So this is Harsha Walia. Quote, "I don't think we can have a global anti-imperialist struggle that doesn't understand how increasingly migration is a pillar of global governance. I don't think we can fight capitalism without looking at how central labor migration is to the continued exploitation and extraction of capital." So besides, the sort of basic, more general reasons I just said, thinking about imperialism, thinking about capitalism itself, one of the very key ways to think about it is thinking about it through migration and borders. So before I get into these arguments for open borders, I think there's a couple things I'd like to touch on about where we are right now. A lot is happening with the change in administration, with the new Biden administration. And I think it's just critical to keep abreast of what's going on and all the changes that are being either implemented or proposed. So central to all of those is the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. And that is the immigration bill, the comprehensive immigration reform bill that Biden put out a couple of weeks ago at this point now. And I want to lay out a couple of what I see. I've spent a lot of time looking at the bill, thinking about the bill. I want to lay out a couple sort of the highlights and lowlights of it, and sort of where it stands politically a little bit. So I should also mention, we're going to do this question and answer, or conversation more back and forth in a few minutes. But if there's a burning question or something, or I'm just say something totally off, or you want to add something in, feel free to raise a hand or just shout out or something. So this U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. So there's a number of parts of it, and it's this huge, comprehensive, this beast of a bill. The central pillar of it is the quote earned path to citizenship. So the way to gain citizenship for the 11 million or so undocumented folks currently in the United States is that they will have to have been in the United States before January 1st of this year. So they couldn't have come afterwards. And I think right away, there's two things that pop out. He's calling it an earned path to citizenship, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment, that you have to earn it. And the second is, it is, I think, in large part, calling it an immigration bill is wrong. It is a regularization bill, which is a gross word. I don't have another one right now to offer, but it doesn't change substantively the way people are going to be migrating. There are some tweaks to it, but substantively, the system we have in place right now is going to be fiddled with a little bit. But really, the bulk of the bill is about the people who are already here. And that's a model that we've seen in comprehensive immigration reform bills, or the amnesty bill, for example, under Reagan in '86 for a long time. And that in itself raises a lot of questions and red flags that it is going to, again, create this two-tiered system, or rather perpetuate this two-tiered system of people who now can gain a pathway to citizenship or obtain citizenship, and people who don't, people who've come after January 1, or all the other, for all the other reasons that they may not be eligible, which are having committed a felony or a couple misdemeanors, 3 misdemeanors, and then there are a couple other grounds for dismissal. If they meet the necessary requirements, then they will they can apply for a lawful prospective immigrant status, LPI, and that can last up to 6 years, but have to remain in it for 5 years. After 5 years, if they meet all the requirements, they can then apply for LPR, which is a lawful permanent residence. In other words, you get a green card. After being an LPR for 3 years, then you can apply for citizenship. All those are applications, and there's no guarantees you're going to get them. So the shortest turnaround time for the initial application to obtaining citizenship is 8 years. But let's take into account the state of USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency that is going to be processing all these claims. As recently as last fall, they were practically insolvent. They were talking about potentially furloughing 70% of their employees. They got over that hurdle, and they are still an agency, but nearly, they were in existential crisis very recently. On top of that, and this is semi-related, there are 1.3 million immigration cases backlog in courts right now, in immigration court right now. So 8 years, I think, is the absolute lowest. And I think I would be incredibly surprised if it wasn't at least a decade, and perhaps a lot longer than that. So that is the pathway to citizenship. There are some expedited pathways, and there are some people who can kind of get ahead of the line, and those are people who have DACA, Dreamers, then people who are agricultural workers, as long as they've worked up, I think it's like 400 days in the United States within the last few years. And they potentially could get LPR status, or legal permanent residency, much sooner. Then the second major piece of the bill is addressing the root causes of migration. And so there's a couple sort of tranches to this as well, but basically it's $1 billion in funding for 3 countries. So addressing the root causes of immigration for 3 countries would be the better way to put it. But the title is just of root causes of migration in general. And those countries are El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So it's $1 billion over the next 3 years. Then there's a system that they suggest they'll put in place where refugees and asylum seekers could apply from those countries rather than coming to the United States and then applying. There's a Central American minors program, which is basically fast tracks the application for minors. And there are a couple other small pieces of this. That $1 billion is going for police reform, for combating corruption, for bolstering civil society. Everything that I just mentioned has been tried exactly before and recently. So in 2014, Biden, who was then the emissary to Central America under the Obama administration, basically decided that he was going to solve or something Central America, and he put in place exactly those things. He asked for $1 billion. He got 750 million. He put the Central American Minors Program into place, which was suspended under Trump. He put a method, he instituted a method for people to apply from those countries. And I talked to a handful of administrators in Honduras and in El Salvador who were fielding those applications. And I never got an exact number, but a lot of people, most people in government just completely forgot that that program existed. And I think the closest estimate would be about 10 people both applied and then made it to the United States through that program. So it didn't work in 2014, 2015 when it was put in place. I think some of those things are good, and I hope some of them work a little bit, and avoiding a very dangerous path to get to the United States to ask for asylum would be great, but we'll see if it works. So those are the 2 kind of big things of the bill. There's a handful of others, and some of it is pretty good. There's a canceling of the 3 and 10-year ban. So if someone doesn't have status in the United States, they leave the country and they come back, they wouldn't be allowed, or they try to come back, they wouldn't be allowed to come to the United States for 3 years or 10 years, depending on their situation. That would be canceled. That's great. Because that is a huge obstacle for a lot of people. There's also removing the 1-year deadline to apply for asylum, which makes a big difference in a lot of cases of people who are applying for asylum here. It raises the number of employment visas. There's a couple interesting things that it does too. It makes it more difficult for a president to institute something like a Muslim ban. They have to address Congress first. Then DHS would have to explore alternatives to detention. That would be like ankle bracelets typically, or letting people out on their own recognizance under parole or basically some form of parole. It would also push DHS to institute some reforms with Border Patrol, like having basically a hotline to call doctors if there's a medical issue. It would have them install rescue beacons along the desert, which sort of sounds good, but this is also something that I've spent a fair amount of time looking at and doing some reporting on. And the rescue beacons don't rescue people. They, in fact, often scare people. If they work, and the number of times they work is, again, it's just so minuscule that people are, I guess, rescued, but then afterwards they're detained, often quickly processed and deported under pretty difficult situations that can further imperil their health. And it's like truly trying to do this smart sort of border wall instead of the hard concrete structures. And that too has been tried before. And that too has become just like this crazy boondoggle. It's like a very expensive, non-functioning, or if it works, it basically scares migrants and drives them further into the desert and puts them in even more danger. Then let me think. Oh yeah, I'm pulling this back up. A couple other things, which I think also merit much greater conversation, but they really crack down on basically the E-Verify system. So sanctioning employers, which a number of studies have found that really doesn't work. It does scare employers and occasionally will go after one or two big employers that are working with a lot of undocumented folks, but it basically drives people even further into the shadows where they're subject to further exploitation, lower wages, more dangerous working conditions. So that is basically my read. Those are the things that really stand out to me. It's like a 400-page bill. And there are some good things in it. And I think that one thing that's worth recognizing is how far this administration has been pushed by activists and migrant rights folks who really, in comparison to previous comprehensive immigration reform bills, this is a lot less awful, but it's still very much a continuation of a system that is extremely deadly and dangerous. The issue is, and I spelled out, I just spent just a few minutes right now walking through this whole thing, but the issue is that it's not going to pass, and I think that is the case for a couple different reasons. One is we are about to enter into a very contentious few months, maybe longer, around what is going on at the border. So there are very quickly spiking numbers of people who are crossing the border right now, a lot of unaccompanied minors. DHS Secretary Mayorkas said last week that the government expects 117,000 unaccompanied minors this year. Could be higher than that. It could be slightly lower. That is a huge number, and we haven't seen those numbers in over 2 decades. They don't right now, as the system is in place, have the capacity to process their word and their system, these migrants. And they will either be released, which I would advocate for heavily, but that is going to cause a lot of problems, especially on the right. That's going to cause just like this huge reactionary explosion. Or they're going to be backed up, they're going to be bottlenecked because of this processing system, and they're going to end up again in what we called, especially in 2018, 2019, cages, Border Patrol short-term holding facilities. Everyone I'm talking to right now at the border, all the people who are involved in these shelters are just getting ready and bracing themselves for a huge influx. And it's already happening. Every day there's more and more people coming. Mayorkas also said last week that we will see tents. So people will be held in tents, probably children and maybe families. So I'm trying to think, there's it's just so much to talk about. The issue is that this is ongoing. There are occasional wins, just 20 minutes before I jumped on this call, I got an email, a couple press releases that TPS is going to be extended to Venezuelans. That's definitely a win. That's not a final solution, but that's something that's good, that gives actual protections to people who are currently here. And yet the system is in place, and the system is incredibly violent. People 15,000 or so, the exact number is a little hard to come by right now because of so many changes in COVID, are currentently in ICE detention centers. And they are in very difficult situations, like very unhealthy, very dangerous, and sometimes deadly situations. ICE continues to deport people. There's been 1,000 people deported in the last couple of weeks to Haiti that's undergoing a deadly political crisis. So things are dire. And that brings me to trying to make this argument for open borders. You know, one of the ways I like to start is by, like, to me, the most convincing argument for open borders is the moral argument. I think, you know, sort of the other way that I could explain it is just saying that it's like a human argument. And there's a number of ways to get deep into it, but really what it comes down to is that borders kill. Borders kill people. They don't protect people. They don't safeguard culture. They don't protect the environment, which is a claim that, you know, some like eco-fascists are making now. They don't keep you safe at night or keep anyone safe at night. What they do is they marginalize, they exploit, they cause suffering, misery, death, and disappearance. So, you know, that happens at every border, actually. And there's more borders right now than ever before in the history in all of history. So borders are proliferating, migration is proliferating, and border deaths and suffering because of the implementation of borders or bordering is ballooning right now. And so my question is, so on what moral grounds is any of this justified at all? So why does the United States government get to put these policies in place and say that someone who comes to this country, someone who steps foot on this particular patch of soil has to earn their citizenship? Like, how do they get to make that decision? And I don't think that it is based on any moral grounds. And I think that's a really important, for me, starting point. And one of the most clear ways that, or to me at least, one of the clearest ways that really drives home that lack of moral grounding for implementing these kinds of incredibly dangerous and deadly policies is looking at history. So I'm going to try to run through a little bit here and give a couple examples. I'm actually going to start in 18th century Australia. And I think that first, it's really important. Like, we can get sort of sucked into just talking about the United States, but immigration is such a huge international issue. And it's really important to have a lot of sort of perspective of what is going on elsewhere in the world. The United States is learning a lot from other countries who are really cracking down on migration. The United States is also teaching a lot of countries. And so, yeah, so to 18th century Australia. This is when, so the initial invaders of Australia were the Dutch, but soon after started following the British. And they, you know, immediately, as the Dutch did before them, started slaughtering and dispossessing both the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, which is like the northeastern, like kind of like a cone on the top of Australia. And they justified that colonization, that dispossession, through this concept, this legal concept called terra nullius. It's Latin for nobody's land. And it was claiming that nobody owned the land because there were no white Christian people in the land. So they used the system to, you know, enslave, deport, dispossess, you know, just run over the native people of Australia. And once they sort of had established themselves, or also even deport people too, as like you know, a lot of people recognize the idea of modern Australia as like this penal colony, also deporting people to Australia. Then soon after they had established themselves, they instituted, it is in 1901, they instituted an official White Australia policy, which is really just like a collection of different policies that really targeted Asian and Pacific Islanders. So unless you could pass a number of different tests, basically like literacy tests, you couldn't migrate to Australia. And it was very clearly targeted at Asian and Pacific Islanders because they were the both closest to people who are currently migrating. And soon after that, and white Australia was on the books for 5 decades or so. I think it wasn't officially canceled until the 1960s. Soon after that, they also pushed this policy called populate or perish, where their goal, and they recognized that there supposedly weren't enough people on the continent of Australia. So what they did was they encouraged migration from the UK, and they encouraged procreation and really tried to fill out the land. So this very selectively enforced borders continued into the 21st century. And here we saw some like really dramatic moves. One is there was this like huge like sort of political fiasco in 2001 called the Tampa Affair, where a ship full of Iranian and Afghani migrants, asylum seekers, were trying to come to Australia. Australia did all they could to block them. They eventually landed on one Australian island, Christmas Island, and there they made their asylum claims. And the country was so incredibly like adamant in not letting them make an asylum claim that actually excised Christmas Island from Australian territory. So they redrew the map. So Christmas Island was no longer part of Australia. And they go further. They go much further than this. You saw, like, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, they start outsourcing immigration detention to islands such as Nauru, which are like where people languish just miserably and indefinitely. There's an incredible, just like really haunting book written by an Iranian man, Behruz Boochani, No Friend But the Mountains, who describes his 4 or 5 years, I think, stuck on this island in a just miserably squalid detention center. So all of this, so what we see here is this very selectively permeable border. The border was completely open to them, such that they could invoke this terra nullius, this doctrine of discovery. They encouraged migration, they deported people to it. Then they changed the borders by excising Christmas Island. They like sort of pushed the border out by using Nauru as this like external detention site. And all of it is done to exert control, to gain land and power and capital. And here I'm going to quote Harsha Walia again, who put it really nicely, actually, in her book, that, put another way, the border is elastic and the magical line can exist anywhere. And that is just the case. So we see that very clearly looking briefly at the history of Australia. The United States, of course, the history of the United States border is no less twisted. This is something that I'm sure y'all are much more familiar with, but from the initial establishment of the colonies to the genocide of the indigenous people to the shifting border with New Spain, the incorporation of Texas, the invasion of Mexico or the US-Mexican War, the Gadsden Purchase, like all of it, you see the border just shift and change over the years. And interestingly here for us, well, first, they also used terra nullius, or this idea of doctrine of discovery. And in 1823, it was actually written into a Supreme Court case. This is where, and I'm going to pull up another quote here in a moment. This was in the case Johnson and Graham Lisi versus McIntosh, 1823. And this is, they're trying to dispossess Native Americans, indigenous people, of their lands. And this is from the majority decision. The exclusion of all other Europeans necessarily gave to the nation making the discovery the sole right of acquiring the soil from the natives and establishing settlements upon it. It was a right with which no Europeans could interfere. So more or less, it's like a domestic Monroe doctrine. It's like, we discovered it, it's ours, no one else can mess with it. And they cited a couple times this doctrine of discovery, this terra nullius. Interestingly, I'm going to get back to this idea of this moral question. On what moral grounds are they doing this? Interestingly, it wasn't just the border. It wasn't just the actual physical geography of the country, or the political geography of the country. It's also the to whom they granted citizenship, as we saw in Australia too. So you see how that changes over the years as well. In 1790, there's the Naturalization Act, which extended citizenship to free white persons of good character, something almost like that. We know that free white person, or what person there only meant men. Good character, whatever. And then we saw, like after that Supreme Court decision, 1823, in McIntosh, we saw this use of citizenship as a tool. And I think this is really interesting to underscore the contingent, the elastic nature of citizenship itself. So a number of southern states, as they were trying to take more and more land from the indigenous, appealed to the federal government to extend citizenship to indigenous people. And it wasn't out of benevolence. They were using it as a threat. They said, okay, if you become citizens, you'll be subject to our laws, you will be required to pay taxes, and you will be under the full jurisdiction of both the federal and the state governments. And they were threatening, and in Georgia, they actually did extend citizenship, full citizenship, to some of the indigenous folks, but they were using it as a threat, and it worked. That was one of the key tools that got some of the indigenous tribes to sign agreements with the Jackson administration, which led to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and one of the major deportations of that century. 80,000 people pushed west. So here, to me, this really underscores how susceptible, how malleable is both the concept of citizenship and then the border itself. So to me, like, when we're trying to answer this question, like, how do we decide who gets to be in? Or like, think of this question that, or this comment that Trump often would invoke: without a border, you don't have a country. Something that he said quite a lot, and a lot of people have echoed it. But you try to pin down that border, and it's always moving. Right now it seems very static, but it's not. And think of someone else. Think of like a subaltern subject making that same argument that we saw in Australia or in the United States. Think of them saying, well, you push the border this way a little bit, you push it that way, you let these people in and those people, like, it's kind of historically contingent, so we can like fiddle with it. You would see the full force of the law just raining down on them. But that shouldn't, like, I'm framing it as a hypothetical question, but we see that every day. We still see that every day. That the violence that people who merely walk across a line are subjected to is hard to really fathom. I think, unless you go through it. And there's a couple other examples, and I realize I'm probably going a little long now, but it's not just about the individual breaching the border, where we see the US react with such incredible violence. Because they say, oh, the border is sacrosanct. But they can move it, and they have. You just like a glance at history, they can move it. What you also have seen, there's a couple of really interesting examples in history of the incredibly violent reaction when there's been proposals to actually change the border. So there's one, which is the Zimmerman telegram, which was actually one of the key points that, like, the tipping points that got the United States to enter into World War I, was when Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying that if they joined on their side, that they would gain back some of the states they lost in 1848. And that was one of the reasons that the United States entered World War I. You also see this just incredible insistence, this incredible and like nonsensical insistence in southwestern Arizona with the Tohono O'odham Nation, whose ancestral lands went both ways across the border. And yet the Border Patrol insists that there are walls, that there's all this surveillance infrastructure, that Border Patrol like uses their roads or builds new roads. There's like a really moving campaign right now that's been going on for years. And one of the slogans is, in O'odham, there is no word for wall. So what it comes down to me is that there is no moral justification. Or when someone crosses the border and a Border Patrol agent stops them, the only real justification is the gun that the Border Patrol has on his or her hip. And that sense of just like the violence and all of that stands for is the only way that they are able to consistently and still enforce it. And so really, I think that terra nullius has given way to this idea of the concept of conquest, the right of conquest. So once you conquer land, then it's yours. And that was another legal doctrine that was in effect for a long time that got finally canceled after World War II. They said, well, we're not going to use this idea of right of conquest. So like where one country isn't going to conquer another country, and because they win, they get to keep the land. So there's like this detente that in this international legal idea. But that like what they ended on was a situation where much of the world, though there's been certain changes, have been able to keep the land that they violently conquered. And they violently conquered, and they used this idea of terra nullius to do it. There's a couple other ways to, I think, approach this moral question. And this is kind of where I'll end. There's this Canadian philosopher, Joseph Cairns, who describes this situation where someone faces extraordinary difficulty, almost impossibility, depending on this exact situation, of moving to a place, of moving to another place, just simply that. And, you know, someone walking across the US-Mexico border, for example, will face arrest, detention, maybe indefinite detention, torture, I think it's safe to say, and deportation. And someone walking the other direction, if they're a US citizen, like I've done hundreds of times, faces no consequences. Joseph Cairns says that that difference is akin to feudal birthright privileges, that someone, just because of the family or the village that they were born into, has a almost insurmountable a chance of changing their social position by any means. You know, one thing that he doesn't mention, Joseph Cairns, that this philosopher who talks about these feudal birthright privileges, is that feudalism ended, which is good. And, you know, it gave way to capitalism, which is tricky. But feudalism did end. And it probably, well, I think this is something I think about a lot, is like people who were living even at the tail end of this, in this feudal system, probably didn't see immediately a way out of it, but it did end. And I think that the just absolutely grossly discriminatory practice we have right now of violently enforcing borders and immigration controls isn't inevitable. And looking at like just some of the history that I mentioned today, how much and how quickly things have changed, I think that is cause for hope. I went like way over what I was going to talk about. I was like pretty excited about talking about economics, which are just like a huge way to get into this conversation about open borders, and a place that a lot of people are talking about it now, or like, you know, many people approach the issue from an economic or standpoint, but I want to be, you know, respectful of folks' time and get into this conversation. So perhaps that's something we can discuss in some breakout groups, or at least we can get into in some questions now. But that's basically my spiel for y'all. Yeah, if there's people want to chime in, please. If people want to ask questions, I'll see if I can answer them, or maybe someone else can answer them. That'd be great too.
Okay, are we going to jump straight into questions then? No? Okay.
I can go over community agreements real quick, if that's okay.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that. Yeah.
No worries. Thank you so much, John, for that great talk. Yes, I see people already getting on Slack, so everyone knows what to do. But just to go over a couple of points real quickly, we're not a huge group, so it probably shouldn't be an issue, but just to go over that, obviously assuming that everyone's here to learn, we're gonna assume good intentions and be comradely always in the discussion, like you guys are already doing. If you have a question, feel free to just type the word stack into the chat. and you will be called on when it's your turn. And the last thing that we ask is to please keep your questions brief, like 30 seconds or less, just to be considerate. If you have like a multi-tiered question, just go ahead and put yourself back on stack and ask the other question later, just to keep it easier for everybody else. Try to keep it to a minimum, keep it simple. And that should be pretty much it. If anyone wants to add anything else, yeah, we can probably go ahead and get started. Ashley, you can take it away.
Thank you, Mia. Okay, Carrington.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for your talk. I have to ask, what if you could give the broad strokes of the economic arguments for immigration or open borders?
Sorry, that was just you asking me to give the broad strokes?
Yeah, what you were going to describe.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much in detail.
Yeah. So, okay, so there's like one is, I think that this is to me like the most important point is that we can go almost point by point and say, look, migrants are not a drag to the economy. We can say that migrants do not use welfare or, they have very little access to actual welfare benefits. We can say that they do not depress wages or take jobs, all those things, all of which are true. But when we were making those points, to me, it is like, this is where we need to start, is we can't fall into the trap of commodifying migrants, because that is one of the problems. That's one of the sources that is driving immigration enforcement. That's one of the sources that is driving militarized borders, is the commodification of migrants. Capitalist class is drawing these borders, enforcing these borders, and sending people home and creating this underclass of non-citizens to extract money from them. And one quick quote here that I think is sort of shocking to think about sometimes. In 1984, there was a Wall Street Journal opinion piece, an op-ed that called for a 5-word amendment to the US Constitution. And that amendment would be, there shall be open borders. They weren't calling for open borders because that was the right thing to do, and like that, like in terms of reparations for the people that have, the border has been crossed, and like all these things. They saw it as an economic opportunity, and it is. All studies point to that, and even in times of crisis. There's been so many studies that have done, like there was a huge inflow of migration. There's a labor supply shock. What happened? Actually, not that much. It wasn't bad. It didn't completely disrupt the economy. It didn't depress native wages, even during moments of crisis. And there's been interesting papers looking at after 1929 stock market crash. There was the Mexican Repatriation Act, which deported 2 million people, many of whom were Mexican, many of whom were Mexican-American, actually American citizens. And one of the driving factors was that supposedly there's, 30% unemployment numbers. Oh, if we get rid of some of the other people competing for American jobs, those jobs will be open, or they won't be in competition with natives. But in rural places where a lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were deported from, you saw actually native employment go down as well. That like any of those points about welfare, about wages, about job numbers are all things that we could get into much detail about. The other thing that I think is just absolutely crucial is the labor argument. And that is where we think of approaching the call for open borders from a labor position of solidarity, where we know that, for example, after NAFTA, 700,000 industrial jobs in the Midwest were lost, a couple million in Mexico. And those jobs were consolidated into, especially in northern Mexico, in the Maquila zone, where union membership went way down, where wages actually decreased, productivity increased, and to see that clear, just ruining of different ways of life in this to hyper commodify, hyper exploit these people in this, what have become like incredibly dangerous. It's a little complicated, but what have become this strip of hyper exploitation and violence. To not be able to talk about unionizing together, to be able to talk about, because you can't. And the manufacturing corporate class is able to exploit those differences. And the very last thing, I think, just in terms of framing that I'll say is not clearly just about knocking down the wall. And this is something that, you know, I mentioned this conversation I was having with Harsha Walia recently, and she talks about this a lot. If you knock down the wall, that would be a good thing. I would be for that. But you need to also really think hard about the social and economic conditions that erected that wall, or that force people to need to flee, or to want to flee, or to, you know, because the wages are so low. So it would have to be this huge economic project, as well as the stripping down of the wall, so that there's like some stability or some sort of balance reached, where there isn't a pressing, dire need to actually migrate, which is the other like huge part about open borders: the right to migrate and also the right to stay home. And the right to stay home is something that is a huge economic question, and you need to think very hard and in many complex ways about how you could guarantee that. But I think it's an economic question, in large part, not exclusively, obviously.
I did put myself on Stack, so to keep it progressive and prioritize voices that aren't often heard, I'll just plug my question in. It's somewhat similar to Carrington's. What would be your response to someone concerned about a lack of equitable distribution of resources in a world where there is a completely open border structure? I think it touches on the last point that you just made, without really being able to, as our own country, control what happens in other countries, avoid economic drainage of other countries. And, you know, let's say everyone wants to come to New York, an overburdened economic system, once people flee or migrate to specific areas. What is the economic argument against that? Because I won't lie, that's where I struggle with the concept of of open borders.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think that I don't have an answer for it. I would be suspect if anyone claimed to, because I think it really changes place to place. But, you know, yeah, like the last sort of point I was making before, I think is really crucial here, is that, well, one is I think that it would self-regulate to some degree, that opening borders would, you know, maybe initially result in a pretty rapid migration. But I think that after that sort of settle a little bit, I don't think it would just be continuous. There's been some like studies on how many people right now, if they could, would come to the United States. And like they tried to calculate that number. It was like 100 million or something, which is a pretty big number. But how many people could come to the United States? How many people would come if they couldn't come at first and they saw that already 20 million people came, you know? So I think there's, to some degree, it's self-regulating. And then second is, you can't just open the border. I mean, I think you could. I think that would be, you know, better than the deadly, dangerous situation we are currently in. But you have to look at the rapacious colonial, neo-colonial exploitation ongoing of so many of the countries that people are coming or fleeing from. And if you don't take that into consideration, and you don't think about what the United States, I mean, Lee mentioned at the beginning, Central America, which has been one of my you know, main focuses in my reporting. You know, $1 billion divided between those three countries, especially given the government that the United States has helped propped up for a long time, isn't going to stem migration. I don't think at all. I think there are ways to stem migration in those countries. I think that those countries deserve from the United States and from their own government, many of whom are, you know, very exploitative ruling class, something like reparations, something like a, you know, universal basic income, something like the destruction of these free trade zones that create maquila industries that exploit, create violent neighborhoods, rip people away from their, you know, smaller towns that were once livable. And I think it's so complex, and yeah, I just don't have the knowledge to get into all of it, but like I could give like a couple examples along those lines. And I think that there you can really sort of quell some of the understandable worries that like, what would happen if so many people came? I just reviewed this other book by Matt Iglesias, who is this Vox character blogger, and his book was called 1 Billion Americans. And he came from a very different point that I came from, but he was making the argument that 1 billion Americans economically would actually be really good for the country. And, you know, I don't completely disagree with him there. I sort of have a different take on his means and his ends. But 1 billion Americans in, you know, the current landmass that the United States has, we would be still far less densely populated than many European countries. So it wouldn't just be this crush of people. Like, it's scary maybe because we're here in New York and man, it's already loud and full of traffic. But, you know, there's other ways to do it. And you have to be smart about how you do it. You can't just tackle the one thing, which is opening the gates. I hope that, a little rambly, but I hope that answered your question.
Wow, that's a great answer.
Okay, thank you.
Next we'll have Mia.
Thank you. I guess a bit more of like a basic question, but I think there is still like a lot of confusion in these discussions about the difference between open borders and just no borders at all. So I was wondering if you could go into that distinction a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I still definitely am trying to wrap my head around. So, you know, if you talk about no borders, what you're talking about is no nation states. And again, to be honest, this is the second question in a row. I'll just like cop to, I don't know exactly what that would look like. Like, I'm interested, and I'm like starting to try to think about it, but it would be a clear shakeup of like a major revolutionary shakeup of the current global structure, which I think is a conversation that needs to be had. I don't think that open borders absolutely means the dissolution of the nation state. You know, I think that there is still room for some organizing collective or principle, and to draw some sort of like boundary of not a physical one and not an enforced one, at least as we have it now, around like, these are the people that are organizing together for the collective goodwill of the residents. And I think that you could potentially call it a nation state, you could call it something else. But I mean, I think you have to be clear that when you say no borders, I don't think you can mean anything else but the complete dissolution of the nation state, which, I mean, given the record of the rise of nation states, which, you know, people talk about like the, you know, Treaty of Westphalia is the first time that there's like this mutual recognition of sovereignty, which was 1643. But really, the nation state didn't really establish itself until after World War I, dissolution of some of the empires in Europe. And, you know, that was a messy process, and it didn't result in lasting peace. And now, you know, things have definitely sort of cemented in their solid ways. But I again, like going back to like the shifting borders and shifting ideas of citizenship, nothing is permanent. I think that's really helpful to remember, that we are in this position, and I think we should recall that we don't have to be. So it's a great question to ask.
Ava?
Sorry. I had a mix, like I had a bookshelf collapse. I'm like, I wasn't ready for snack. So I was just, John, thank you for being here. So I was just kind of wondering, you know, that there's some stuff going on, like some people are saying that, you know, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean are kind of in the crux of building a correct immigration policy. Or like correct immigration policy. So I was just wondering, you know, is that true? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry about your bookshelf. I would say, I think I could objectively say that's not true. I hardly know where to start, but I think you'd have to address each of those countries. The United States has been pressuring for a long time. I mean, going back to 2008, going back to the beginning of the Merida Initiative, which is this huge security funding package that the United States gives to Mexico, going back again to 2014 after the so-called unaccompanied minor crisis that Biden managed. The United States has been putting a lot of pressure, throwing a lot of money at outsourcing immigration enforcement, and not only to those countries. I mean, that again we should remember. But I caught news just recently that the Dominican Republic is reinforcing their border with Haiti right now. The United States has a Border Patrol office in the Dominican Republic. They have Border Patrol agents, ICE agents in Mexico, in Honduras, in El Salvador, and in Guatemala. And they have been really working hard to get those countries to do their will. At the beginning of January, we saw the beginnings of a caravan or another exodus of people, mostly from Honduras, and Guatemalan military violently repelled them with sticks. I mean, it was just like a horrific scene. El Salvador created their own border patrol a couple of years ago. All three of those countries signed on to these just laughable, if it weren't so incredibly dangerous and disturbing, asylum and cooperative agreements, where they supposedly were going to take asylum seekers that were fleeing those very states. And then even within the countries, so this is like just to maybe highlight both, I guess, like the paradox and the danger of US training and funding these sorts of initiatives. So go back to the caravan I just mentioned in early January. There is an agreement between the 4 Central American countries, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. There's free transit between them. So the people who are coming from Honduras into Guatemala with the intention, or so it was believed, to make it to the United States, were crossing a boundary that they should have all legal rights, that under international treaty, they had a legal right to cross, and that they were violently repelled and they didn't cross. I think a few people snuck by, but almost all of them were turned back. So the United States is pushing hard to get people to violate even international treaties. Yeah, and there's just so much to say there, but Mexico too has been really, there's a lot of hope when the current President AMLO took over that things would be different, and he certainly promised that they would. But what we're seeing is, the unleashing of heavily armed, basically soldiers, now policing migrants passing through Mexico. So, not great.
Next we'll have Obi.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. So I read a New York Times article the other day, and it said that the Democrats are going to have a hard time with Hispanic and Latino voters. And the voters they interviewed pointed out that immigration is a big issue for them. It's one of the reasons why they went Republican. And they think that they feel like they did citizenship the right way. So do you think that open borders, abdicating it, would play into the Republicans' hands and make places like Texas, Florida, Arizona, and the rest of those places harder to win?
That's a really good question. Yeah, maybe. I mean, honestly, possibly. I'm not a political strategist. I like, reading about political strategy, but I feel like, I don't know, my personal position as a journalist and as a activist with DSA and other activist organizations is to think hard about some of these questions and think hard about what open borders would look like and what it would imply, and also to reach for the ideal. I think that one of the driving motivators for me in thinking and writing about open borders is that otherwise it's dismissed out of hand. And I think already we've seen sort of a slight recalibration under the Biden administration compared to the Obama administration of how we're talking about how the left or left-ish side of the Democratic Party is talking about immigration. And I still think that there's this kind of vacuum of understanding of what open borders is. There's just this knee-jerk, well, you can't have open borders, but people should have a pathway to citizenship. But then what we see in practice is it becomes an earned pathway to citizenship that's going to take a decade or more, and a lot of people aren't going to qualify for it. And so, this is my personal opinion, but I think even someone like a group like DSA it would be of service to call for what is the actual ideal. And we won't institute it, or won't anytime soon, but drawing people towards a more just immigration system, towards a less murderous immigration system, I think is a good step to take. But we might lose some, yeah, like I said at the beginning, like there's no clearer driving factor to join a hard right party than anti-immigrant sentiment and fear of immigrants. And calling for open borders might incite some of that fear, but maybe part of our duty is to call for open borders, but also be like, hey, it's not going to be that bad. Like there are open borders within the United States, for example, which there are, and like it could be scary for, someone from a rural part of, Georgia to all of a sudden have a bunch of migrants coming from, New York. But, that's things like that have happened in the United States. And I think walking through some of those scenarios and like walking people off the ledge of joining, I don't know, the 3%ers or something, is good, a good thing to do. Is a worthy project.
Jeremy?
Hey, John, thanks so much. This is really interesting. I mean, I definitely agree with what you pointed out about labor solidarity. And I thought, one other thought I was having, this is just like a response, and then I'll ask a question, was just like that, again, there's an opportunity. Trump is so polarized the issue that actually arguably America is more pro-immigrant than it's ever been. And so I think to some degree, the strategic questions for the left are like how to solidify that, how to grow it, how to pull as many people in as possible and kind of maintain the actually somewhat better climate is. Because I think you're right, even compared to the Obama years, just kind of public opinion and general sentiment is much more pro, which is good for our politics. I guess I had two questions. One, I was just curious about what you mentioned briefly about expectations about kind of a lot of migration going to be happening soon. I was just curious as to why and kind of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And then my second question was, more broadly, I guess on, how on this question of like how we talk to people, how one convinces others. I mean, I think there are some plausible reasons for some working class people, like native working class people, to fear immigration, or at least like a kind of more open borders tending policy, insofar as like one of the kind of most dramatic and ambitious kind of border reducing policies of the last generation has been the EU, which generally I think has been this anti-democratic kind of nightmare and has decreased the power of welfare states within its boundaries. Now, that's not to say that like immigration had much to do with that, but I think convincing people that sort of it's possible to do kind of freer flow of people policy that isn't bound up with decreasing the power of working class organizations or policies within national borders. I think, it is an act of imagination, but kind of the closer imagination is something that just happened recently. So I'm kind of curious about how you think about the EU as sort of like a, in some ways, negative example and something, I don't know. It feels like the EU is to like open borders, sort of what like Soviet Union was to like communism in a previous generation of like kind of like a horror story-ish for a lot of people. So yeah, just curious on that.
Yeah, interesting. To your first point, your comment, it really is remarkable. It's easy to forget how much the conversation has shifted. Look at some of the comments that I wish I had them here in front of me, but I don't. I have to dig them up and take a few minutes. But that of the Clintons, the way that the Clintons, who are no models in my view, the way that they talk about immigration, but the shift that they've taken. So you look at Bill Clinton when he was first running for president, when he was president. I mean, absolutely, like it could be a speech if you add in a few sort of nonsensical little stutters or something. It could be a Trump speech. It really could be. And then Hillary in 2008, Hillary in 2016, that transformation too is pretty large. And same with Obama to Biden. Like the way that we're talking about it has really shifted. And I think hopefully we can see that as momentum. Again, I think it's so crucial to remember that we're not in a static place. Like the world of politics, immigration politics is not static, it's moving. So we got to keep pushing it. As for the EU, I mean, that is another really huge topic that is filled with so many sort of cognitive dissonances. But yeah, I think that there's a number of examples of these natural experiments within the EU once they started opening up the free migration zone, or the Schengen zone, where in 2005, a lot of people relatively in a short period of time, mostly from Poland and a couple other Eastern European states, moved to Ireland. And there was a lot of concern. But Ireland absorbed them just fine. Irish employment didn't go down then, it did a little bit later, but for different reasons. And culturally, there wasn't a huge shift. We didn't lose the very strong Irish identity. Things were totally fine. My family is Romanian, and a lot of my family and a lot of people in a number of the villages that my family lives in left for Italy once they were taken to the EU zone. And there too, or left for Italy and Germany, and there too, it was just huge personal success stories with no clear negative ramifications in the receiving communities, except politically. And that's where it gets really complicated. And that with, this rise of a number of far-right parties over the last 15 years, especially in Eastern Europe, but not only, I think that people really harnessed the fear itself rather than the reality of the situation on the ground. And another really disturbing part of this is that as the EU was opened up, internally, the external borders have been hardened, and it is one of the most fiercely guarded borders of the world. It is the most deadly border in the world. The border guards, which we hear about less here, daily enact, arbitrary detention, illegal deportations, murder, and disappearance. So it's I don't know. It's a big topic, but I think that if you look at some of those early examples of what happened, it should be a sort of a good example of look, things can work out and it could be okay. But then especially politically, things turn sour. I mean, to put it lightly.
Okay. Next we're gonna have Doug.
Hi, sorry, I was just actually updating my question. So most of the studies of the effects of immigration on labor markets show little or no hit to employment or wages. But these were done under the current brutal regime that you described. If you had a looser regime, open borders, or tending in that direction, would probably see more migration. We certainly don't know how much, but we probably would. But wouldn't the free movement of people, at least according to economic theory, tend towards the equalization of incomes internationally? Now, there's no principled defense against that, but it's a really hard sell politically. It means the US and other first world countries would see a decline in their living standards. And, again, there's really no principled defense of protecting those. But on the other hand, it's really a complicated issue politically. We've already seen some effects of this with the downward mobility of the working class in the US and Western Europe as globalization has spread. That's the only stratum in the world that's really lost relative income over the last 20 or 30 years. So how do you sell this? Do you have to appeal to something other than self-interest?
I don't think so. Well, one is, it is really complicated. And I'm not an economist, but I have been trying to wrap my head around this a little bit. So, one of the things, like the example that you mentioned of, the loss of, I guess, probably thinking of industrial jobs in the United States to opening up free markets, especially post-NAFTA. That was certainly true. But what you saw there, it wasn't an equalization of, well, that money that was being earned by the people who were formerly working in the factories in Ohio is now being earned by the people working in the factories in Juarez. The wages actually also went down in Juarez. So the number, I think I mentioned this before, but like the number of people in unions dramatically dropped in Mexico post-NAFTA. Actually, I have a number too that it would just take a moment for me to pull up. But, and I think these numbers are worth mentioning here. So here's a couple, and then I'll try to address your question a little bit more broadly. But between 1978 and 2005 in Mexico, the unionization rate for manual labor jobs fell from 43%, which is fairly high, to 19%. A huge drop. By 1990, from 1992, so right before NAFTA, to 2002, wages for manufacturing workers in the northern free trade zone, or the Maquila zone of Mexico, wages fell by 14%. And at the same time, productivity rates doubled. So it wasn't an equalization. It was a double robbery. The corporate factories, the corporations were able to use the new setup to just make more money. So it wasn't like wages were just going somewhere else. But the other bigger, broader question is, and this is where my math capacity just absolutely hits a wall at this point, at least, is that there are estimates that if we completely opened up all borders across the world, because it would hugely increase productivity, it would, not only would capital flow even more easily, labor would flow more easily, people would go where their jobs were, that the global GDP would double. There'd be literally trillions of dollars added to the global GDP if we completely opened up the borders. So, that isn't my favorite argument. And, it seems like a little bit hard to imagine, and maybe it's true. And maybe it would just be like sweet for everyone. But I think that people just don't have that much to fear. And I think that there would be a long time where before things maybe like reached a sort of balance, but in the immediate future, and there have been a number of these scientific studies, or these like natural experiments. I mentioned one from like Poland to Dublin, this like huge labor supply shock. The most famous one is the Mariel boat lift, where for a few months in 1980, 120,000 Cubans moved to Miami. It's a huge number to one city. And there was no negative effect on wages. There's like some people who claim that there was a slight negative effect on some sliver of the workforce, but that sliver was minuscule. And there was a huge influx of people, and more services were needed. More construction came quickly, and things were okay for the native workers. So I think we don't need to like ask people to brace for like a huge change of life, or a huge change of living standards. I think we can like try to talk through some of these numbers and be like, look, like we've seen this in the past, and there's really not that much to worry about. Plus, there is a huge like benefit in terms of equality, like worldwide equality. I mean, like living under an inequality regime, especially with the major numbers I was mentioning at the very beginning of the talk, 1 billion people, 1/10 of all humanity, moving across borders by 2050. What is that going to look like? What is that going to look like? That is something that I think is scary, and not scary in the sense of I'm scared because the barbarians are at the gate, or there's this other coming to my community. It's scary because I know that the Pentagon and DHS is currently preparing for this, and what they're using, or what they're modeling, is more walls, more border guards, and extreme violence to protect this, unsustainable, like, current way of life. And that, I think, is more scary.
Lee?
Yeah, so I just wanted to direct a little towards the foreign policy and how the policy of the US towards the countries in South America, the northern part of South America and Central America, has been part of what's happened here, in that in all those areas, the people fought against the situation that they lived under. And as they did that, developed left, socialist, communist groupings that spoke for the people and waged the struggle. And the United States had a, very tough fight against those people, undermined them, took, went all out to crush those forces. And often what was left in these countries was just corrupt gangs at the end. And that marginalization is a big force in terms of why people are moving across the borders. And so I think sometimes people think, oh yeah, we don't have to address these questions, because sometimes they're difficult. But I think that has to be part and parcel. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, a lot of history there. I saw that in a few more sessions, Vincent Bevins, who's going to be talking about foreign policy. And his book, The Jakarta Method, addresses this very issue really well. Yeah, the United States has been, a imperial colonial force in Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, among many other places throughout the globe for a long time. And they still are. It's changing. The tools are changing a little bit now, but very much we have a very heavy presence in a lot of these countries, and you just don't see it like helping at all. I mean, I think maybe Honduras for me is the clearest case for this. The current authoritarian president in Honduras, elected in a fraudulent election in 2017, is just so clearly involved in a number of murderous drug trafficking gangs, and the U.S. has been standing by him. Like, we saw the first real breaks only within the past few months, and that there has been a trade-off for what is stability for the people who are able to extract wealth from these countries, and for the instability of the people who create that wealth in these countries. And that has been the model that we've seen for 120 years in Honduras, and is over that, and is still continuing today. I mean, the like, more and more Honduras is becoming, and it already very much was, like, almost completely reliant on export commodity system, where what they make is sent to the United States, and the people who are able to buy and sell it are able to reap enormous profits, and the people who create it there. And I've spent a fair amount of time talking and reporting on with them, and seeing the places that they work and live, barely are able to scrape by and make a living. So it's just so abundantly clear. One of the people I profiled briefly in my book, he worked at a maquila in San Pedro Sula in Honduras, making jerseys for the NBA, like the actual jerseys that they wear. He tried to migrate a couple times, was denied asylum, deported twice from the United States, lives in a completely gang-controlled community, can barely go outside, has enough for basic supplies and groceries, and is trapped in his own community. And when you think about like what he's producing, and I don't know, just like the industry of the NBA, which I'm like kind of like the NBA. It's just like sickening, and it's so clear if you just talk to folks or just like look at where these corporations are based and what they're doing in Central America, that they're driving people to flee, or they're driving people to be cornered into like these extremely marginalized communities where if they don't flee, they have to keep their head low and barely scrape by. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answered or addressed your comment or question that much, but yeah, I mean, the reactionary response to a number of different uprisings, especially in El Salvador, very recently, like the peace accords were signed in '94, and they're still sort of living down the extreme violence of 10 years of genocidal war, that the US just dropped out. They just basically backed out of the country after the so-called peace accords were signed. Like the reason we're not talking about reparations, I don't quite get it. But I think one way to consider is reparations in form of migration, open migration.
Okay. Next we have Phil.
Maybe, Ashley, since we're running close to end of time, maybe we want to take like all the last questions at once and do a little lightning round, maybe.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so the last few we have are Phil, Brian, Elijah, and Carrington. So Phil up first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, in terms of open borders, for all practical purposes, the U.S.-Mexico border was largely open, and in some sense still is for people living along that border. People who live in the Rio Grande Valley, cross every single day, both ways. And it's like its own country in a way. Talking to a professor there on the Mexican side, she was saying, well, really, the border is its own region. It's its own thing, and people here, we know each other. Our families live on both sides. It's not a big deal, but it's still really tough. I mean, for instance, in Juarez and El Paso, you've got a city that's divided between two countries, an actual city, a large city. And, it takes 2 hours to cross that border just in the traffic jam. So there are these just crazy kind of impediments to real living, a real way of having an economy and a way of life that these closed borders in many ways make. And then, what John was saying about El Salvador, I mean, the people who are leaving, I mean, definitely there are a lot of people who are leaving because of the violence, especially in Honduras, I think, and El Salvador. But it's also the economy. I mean, the economy is in ruins and has been in ruins really since the end of the war. You talk to people in the countryside and they can't make a living, so they leave. They send their youth north.
Phil, I definitely really appreciate your contribution, but we have about 3 other people that need to ask questions. Do you have any questions specifically you want to direct?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just, I guess, how do we make a clear distinction with, and change the narrative around the fear that our government and our media are creating around around these things, because it's really crazy. It's really stupid.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. Next we have Brian. I just want to remind everybody, try to keep your questions brief because we only have so much time left and we have about 3 other people that want to ask. So go for it, Brian.
How do you think of the concept of national self-determination and who, if anyone, should be entitled to it?
Perfect. And Elijah?
Hey, John, thank you. I'm curious, so given that there's, a current push for greater legalization and paths to citizenship that we haven't seen in quite some time, and like more paths to them, especially with the Dream and Promise Act, but which, obviously paths to citizenship and legalization would mean that there would be a lot more legal workers, which would, increase worker power in the United States, which would hopefully help to bring up wages for all workers. Yet we're not really seeing any real union organizing around or like labor-centered organizing in support of this push for citizenship. We saw a bit of that in like the early 2000s around the first push for comprehensive immigration reform, but curious why you think we're not seeing that right now, or if you're seeing any bright spots related to that.
And I believe our last is Carrington.
Hi, I was going to ask you, John, about DSA's immigration strategies and priority campaigns. Maybe even a word about how you arrived at them, but I don't think we have time for it. But how DSA membership can show solidarity. Only I understand Elijah is willing to take this question because we've had a very long day, John, and we're so appreciative for your contribution.
Great. So I'll try to fire off a few thoughts. Thanks, Phil and Brian and Elijah and Carrington, and good to see a few of you. Good to see all of you, but yeah, I know a few of you. Well, yeah, Phil, I agree. I sort of agree with your idea of that we kind of have open borders for some people, for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, but only for some people. And this brings me back to the idea of the system of bordering and immigration enforcement as being akin to feudal class privileges. Because for some people, you clearly cannot cross. That professor, I don't know exactly her situation, but she has either a visa or a dual citizenship or something. She can cross, but a lot of people just simply cannot. And they can't, if they could potentially get a tourist visa or this, there's a couple different types of like short-term border crossing visas that people can get if they have enough money. So for a lot of people, there are insurmountable barriers, and that is, just not open borders. And to your point about, Central America, I would add one other thing that, on Honduras and Guatemala especially, and Nicaragua also faced 2 devastating hurricanes. And that's something besides the violence in the economy that is really driving a lot of people to increasingly precarious lives or picking up and trying to move elsewhere. I think, Brian, a national self-determination, that's a really good and interesting philosophical question. Like, when does a community get to decide and self-determine the makeup of their community? I don't think there is a real clear answer. I mean, you can say, well, people who have been involved with it for a certain amount of time, potentially, and you could set out some sort of guidelines for now these people are recognized as their own community and they can determine the future of that community. I think that if we were starting from scratch, maybe something like that could be feasible. I still think it's a productive conversation to have, and it's a really good question to ask. But given the current situation of such incredible upheaval of, globalization, forced migration, and I think especially the latter, like forced migration, is something that calls into question, what does this community get to determine? Like, there are some things that like make absolute sense that they can determine, and there are other things that I'm not sure make as much sense, like who is allowed in the community. I mean, at some point, potentially, you run into this scenario where so many people are coming to the community that it imperils the community. And maybe then, do they have this moral right to block people from coming in? Maybe. I guess like a political philosopher could probably like kind of work that one out. I don't think we're there. And, this goes back to this idea of like 1 billion Americans. I think that we're far from actually being imperiled by someone coming in. And I think that the way that we've nationally self-determined up until this point has been done with just utmost violence and, worse, genocide, that at this point, making that claim, I'll speak for the United States, I don't think we do quite have the right in that regard to say this people cannot be part of our community because we have this political right. Little fuzzy answer. I hope that sort of addresses it a bit. But yeah, it's a great thing to try to work out. And Elijah, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that I'm not seeing it really. I mean, of course, there's little flares. Like here in New York, you see maybe a little bit of immigrant rights and labor rights intersecting, and that's great. And I think in LA, that's something that I saw as well. There's Endilon and car wash workers with a lot of working like pretty hand in glove with a lot of pro-immigrant right organizations. And a lot of that did come out of 2005, 6, 7. And we saw like some of the most moving and exciting labor movements in the past, in this century, were led by immigrant workers. And I think it's a shame that we don't recognize that more. And it's a shame that we potentially are missing that possibility of really harnessing some of that vim and vigor that a lot of immigrant communities have and would be willing to use. And then Carrington, I think I lost the last question actually. It was to me or Elijah, but I don't even remember.
I was going to give it to you, and then it turned out Elijah was maybe going to speak on it. But yeah. Just Dsa Initiatives or Dsa Immigration Initiatives and how you arrived at like your short and long-term strategies and how we can offer support. So you or Elijah.
Want to take this one, Elijah? Unfortunately, I've been like a little bit, and I've only gone to a couple meetings in this past few months. So I've been a little out of tune, unfortunately.
I'd like to think that our organizing, at least in New York City, Dsa Immigrant Justice Working Group, which is the space I organize in, tries to address both these things, that are the border stuff and detention and deportation, as well as immigrant worker justice. So our two priorities right now are the Tax the Rich campaign, and specifically messaging around funding excluded workers. And there's 3 weeks left to organize around that, at least in this cycle. And so we're doing that organizing, and there was a march on Friday that we participated in around immigrant worker justice. And yeah, there are not many this way that is happening across the country, and so that I think is key. And then we are organizing around trying to end detention and deportation on the state and local level in New York and New Jersey, which is where the majority of New York immigrants get brought to when they're detained. And so organizing to end local contracts there to push to get people released from detention immediately in solidarity with folks who are on hunger strike right now. There's been really incredible self-organizing of people in detention over the course of the pandemic. And so that's, and we're moving into a phase of that organizing where we're in the process of, through a coalition we're part of, introducing legislation on the New York state level to end ICE contracts in the state. So Jeremy had asked me to drop some links on how to get involved on that. So I'm gonna add a bit of a wall of text in some posts so that you have that at your disposal, including some phone zaps that we do every Friday around that push, and then some more involved ways to get involved in those two efforts.
Thanks, Elijah, and thanks, Ashley and John. I'm just going to make a couple last announcements for Polyed. And also, Elijah mentioned getting involved in an immigrant justice working group right now, especially means also getting involved in the Tax the Rich campaign. Tax the Rich campaign is, at a big push. We just had some very positive coverage in the New York Times. I don't know if people saw, so please give some hours to it. Let's get these bills passed. Very exciting. And then next night school is 2 weeks from today, every 2 weeks. This one is on housing with our crack shot organizer, Sia Weaver, a force of nature and an excellent speaker. So hope to see you there. Bring your friends, talk about the right to housing. And if you need to get in touch with us, if you want to get involved in planning events like this, we'll drop our email in the chat, political education. And of course, if you're not a member yet, join DSA, pay monthly dues to New York City, etc. So thank you so much to everybody. And I think, I get to say goodnight. It's my distinct privilege to say goodnight. So thanks again, John. Thanks to everybody, and have a good night.